Chapter 11. The Story of Iron John and the Goddess in the Garden. So now that you've met the king, and he told the kitchen chef to fire you, what happens in your story? I asked the white buffalo.
The garden. Why we've arrived. Ever since the moment you told me about your dream in the garden, I knew that this story wouldn't die,
said the white buffalo. Yes, we've come a long way, and so far what's happened is that after you left the wild man, you were introduced to the well of the soul where your hair turned gold. You managed to find a castle where you worked in the kitchen, dropped into ashes, and got a brief visit with the second king. So the garden is next?
Yes. After I left the kitchen, I wandered into the garden, which is where the feminine appears, and we're about to meet the non-maternal form in its powerful, blossoming, savvy, wild, instigating, erotic, and playful form. She is the confident woman on the earth plane. On the mythological plane, she could be thought of as the woman who loves gold, which symbolizes spiritual purity. In ordinary daily life, a man meets the maternal feminine at birth, before birth in fact, and it is a solid meeting, or not, depending on the mother and her ability to bond. A man then has many meetings with the feminine in grade school and teenage years. We meet the erotic feminine many times before we actually have taken the Ashes Road. Our story simply ignores these early meetings, for they, though sweet, are not it. Now my story is going to explain the meeting with the feminine woman that happens after the ashes, and the narrative implies that a fruitful meeting of that sort takes place only after the man has left the cellar or kitchen and has gone to the garden. After I wouldn't take off my red tarboosh in front of the king, since I didn't want to reveal my golden hair, the king scolded the cook and was told to fire me. The cook, however, had pity on me and exchanged me for a gardener's boy. Now I was assigned with the duty of setting out plants in the garden. I would water them, chop the soil with a hoe and spade, and let the wind and bad weather do what they wished. Once in summer, when I was working the garden by myself, it got so hot that I pulled off the red tarboosh so that the breeze could cool my head. When the sun touched my head, my hair glowed and blazed out so bright that beams of sunlight went all the way into the bedroom of the king's daughter, and she leapt up to see what it could be. She spied outside and then called to me.
"You there, young man. Bring me a batch of flowers."
I quickly put on the red tarboosh and picked some wildflowers for her, and then tied them in a bunch. As I started up the stairs with them, the gardener met me and said, "What are you doing, bringing the king's daughter such ordinary flowers? Get moving and pick another bunch. Give her the best we have and the most beautiful flowers."
No. The wildflowers have stronger fragrance, and they will please her more,
I said as a young man. When I walked into her room, the king's daughter said,
"Take your head thing off. It isn't proper for you to wear it in my presence."
As a young man, I replied,
I couldn't dare do that. I have a sore, you know.
She grabbed the red tarboosh and yanked it off. My golden hair tumbled down around my shoulders, and she thought it was magnificent to look at. I ran out from her door, but she held me by the arm and gave me a handful of gold coins. I took them and left, but put no stock in them. In fact, I brought the coins to the gardener and said,
"I'm giving these to your children. They can use them to play with."
The next day the king's daughter again called me to her and told me to bring her some more wildflowers. When I walked in with them, she reached for my red tarboosh and would have torn it away, but I held on to it with both hands. Once more she gave me a handful of gold coins, but I refused to keep them and gave them to the gardener as playthings for his children. The third day went the same way, and she couldn't manage to get the red tarboosh off, and I wouldn't accept the gold coins. And so the princess met me as a young man with golden hair. But the gold head also meets the sun. The golden hair had been inactive up till now, something to be kept hidden. Now it does something. As a young man, I sensed that I was being seen, and it was too late because the princess caught on. This moment is called kairos, as the Greeks called it, exactly the right moment for what was lying hidden in one's fate to be revealed. We know we are in the presence of something elaborate here when the storyteller has the sunlight hit the golden hair. Then the light bounces to the wall of the princess's chamber, and from there, this light sinks into her eyes. Through the geometrical diagram, the storyteller adopts a magnificent indirection, a way of introduction involving solar light. I can't praise this detail enough. It's clear that we are once again somewhere in the area of sacred intellect, only this time associated with a woman. The mood of it all is the playfulness of light. If some alchemical themes showed up in the last section of the story, when the young man carried his crude metals up the stairs for the brief meeting with the king, then we feel the alchemical cleverness continue here. We know from hundreds of texts that it is Mercury, or Hermes, who watches over the process of alchemy. This garden scene, with the light shooting about like a ball of mercury that one tries in vain to grasp, is truly mercurial in its invention. Witty, astonishing, playful, serious, delighting in leaps. Many a man can remember meeting a woman who turned out to be faithful for his life in some playful way, whether a telephone number falls out of a wallet, or he goes to the wrong restaurant, or he and she stumble over the curb at the same moment, or they both choose the same book at the library, noticing it at the checkout desk, or the dog's leashes get entangled, or they get assigned the same task at some event and fight over who should do it. All these experiences of coincidence, simultaneity, serendipity, synchronicity, and light suggest that something is about to happen that belongs to, or is part of, the other world. We conclude then that this woman has come into connection with the other world. Let's set down the 4 things we know about this mysterious woman so far. First, she starts things. She requests flowers from the young man. Second, she is the king's daughter, so she is clearly related to the solar fire, the sacred king, or whatever words one wants to use to describe this being high in the sunlit chamber. Third, she likes gold. She likes the golden hair a great deal. We notice that she offers gold coins in return for wildflowers. Finally, she knows something. The king wasn't sure what was beneath the cap, but she knows,
said the white buffalo. But what is the meaning of the garden? I had a similar vision to a great garden where I was called.
All of this began when the cook switched me out for a gardener, and I was assigned to garden work. The word garden in the mythological tradition suggests a walled garden. Garden suggests a place marked out, separated from the farmyard, grain field, forest, or desert, in order that human beings can cultivate precious plants or flowers here. The gardener inside the walls lives beside rare roses, unusual grains, shoots from Persian pears, new varieties of apple trees, and climbing vines. Natural plants develop by intent when inside the walled garden. A garden is created with exquisite intention and attention to detail. Among such traits are the geometrical design of the garden beds, the curiously shaped foundations at the center, and the strange association with alchemy. Alchemical texts of the Middle Ages show how the garden and the fountain looked. A stone foundation, for example, 3 or 4 feet high, built over a well, had sills or tunnels that carried water out to the 4 directions. The alchemists called such a foundation Mercury's well, or the well of Hermes. The Greek god Hermes has a very ancient connection with the walled gardens and all that is enclosed. I find it charming that a can of peaches, for example, is said to be hermetically sealed. Hermes guided the forming of containers, the establishment of boundary places, particularly those areas set aside for inward work. A nun's cloister a meditation room, a deep well, a niche for good, a relationship in which we intend to cultivate a holy tree, a closed tomb, the lover's room, the philosopher's study, and the alchemical vessel or crucible are all hermetic containers. Entering the garden, we escape from the rain of blows offered by the world and find temporary shelter, where springs not fail is a quality of the garden. A walled garden is a shelter from the world and a place to recover from broken trust. The walled garden is also a place to develop introversion, and so Rilke says, "I am too alone in the world, and not alone enough to make every moment holy. I am too tiny in this world, and not tiny enough just to lie before you like a thing, shrewd and secretive. I want my own will, and I want simply to be with my will, as it goes toward action, and in the silent, sometimes hardly moving times when something is coming near. I want to be with those who know secret things, or else alone." We could say that the Greek goddess Demeter owns the surface of the earth, the wheat fields, barley fields, olive groves, vegetable plots, and pastures. We remember that her daughter, Persephone, is playing one day in one of these flower fields when Pluto, or Hades, takes her downward and inward. She goes to live with Pluto, whose name means wealth, and so all of us go, when we go into the walled garden, to encounter the wealth of the psyche, which is especially rich in grief. For me, an unnamed god of duty holds down the surface of the earth, and all the stock markets, all the football fields, all corporation parking lots, all suburban tracks, all offices, all firing ranges belong to this unnamed god. There a man makes a stand, makes a farm, makes an impression, makes an empire, but sooner or later, if he is lucky, the time comes to go inward and to live in the garden. The wild man here is like Persephone. It is in the garden that a man finds the wealth of the psyche. We could say that in the walled garden, as in the alchemical vessel, new metals get formed as the old ones melt. The lead of depression melts and becomes grief. The drive for success, an insistent tin, joins Aphrodite's copper and makes bronze, which is good to make both shields and images of the gods. The enclosed garden then suggests cultivation as opposed to rawness, boundaries as opposed to unbound sociability, soul concerns as opposed to outer obsessions, passion as opposed to raw sexuality, growth of the soul's desires as opposed to obsession with generalized greed for things. While in the garden, we are still doing work in the darkness, but the darkness resembles black earth now. It is in the garden that the soul and nature's soil marry. When we love cultivation more than excitement, we are ready to start a garden. In the garden, we cultivate yearning and longing and notice tiny desires. Paying attention to tiny, hardly noticeable feelings is the garden way. That's the way lovers behave. It can be said that the most significant events in our soul lives to take place in this garden. Initiation then asks every young man at a certain point to become a lover. That is, to develop the lover in him from a seed to flower. We know from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet and other Renaissance accounts that it was not at all unusual for a young man at that time to take 2 to 3 years off and spend it learning to be a lover. Here we may learn an instrument or learn how to write poems. We would practice setting them to music and then sing them to introverted women sitting behind iron window bars. This garden has a sense of longing in it. Garden work may begin unexpectedly. An illness that confines the suffering person to a room for weeks may be enclosed to a garden. An accident may bring it on. Thoreau, on the other hand, chose to live for some months in a cabin he built himself, and he, the cabin, and the walled-in pond were his garden. As he said, "A match has been found for me at last. I have fallen in love with a shrub oak. Some men enter the garden by getting up at 5 a.m. and keeping an hour for themselves before work. Making a garden and living in it means attention to boundaries, and sometimes we need the boundaries to prevent caretaking from coming and occupying all our time. When we are addicted to perfection, we have no garden. The anxiety to be perfect withers the vegetation. Shame keeps us from cultivating a garden. What do we love so much that we want to protect it from strangers? That is a good question for garden makers. As Rilke says, no matter how deeply I go down into myself, my God is dark, and like a webbing made of 100 roots that drink in silence. Now when we examine the story, the young woman managed to bring me into her own room and reveal the golden hair that I'd been hiding. What would it be like for an ordinary boy to meet the woman who loves gold?
Asked the white buffalo. The Muse, the mystical goddess from my dreams. She's out there in the garden, and her vision was a hint, so I must see what it all means.
Of course. Now when it comes to poets, they kept secrets written through the verses, and so they may call their lover a mystical muse or a golden woman for the need of secrecy and containment. If an ancient Greek saw a man who had Zeus energy, he would never say, "That man is Zeus." His mythology distinguished the layers. Now that mythology has collapsed. So many men think they are Zeus and proceed to pursue any and every woman, trying to get her always or away from her husband. But in the garden, a man feels the need to go alone by himself, perhaps to a mountain cabin for 3 months, to write poetry, canoe down a river, and dream. Most men follow the law. They do what is needed in order to survive and fall in line. These men stay with their rulers, and as Yeats writes, all men shuffle there, all cough in ink, all wear the carpet with their shoes, all think what other people think, all know the man their neighbor knows. Lord, what would they think? Did poet Catullus walk that way? You and I, and anyone who enters the garden, has left that law and went toward that of legends. We have left the land of the obedient man and entered the wilderness. As in the story, it shows that I have clearly walked in the other direction, which started from the urge to get the golden ball, which is that spiritual nature that felt trapped or lost. The writer and analyst, John Layard, says that when a man is ready to make a decisive move toward the legend, a female figure whose face looks both ways may appear in his dream. It is as if she has 2 faces. One looks toward the world of rule and laws, and the other toward the world of the dragonish desire, wilderness, and adult manhood. This dream figure is not a flesh and blood woman, but a luminous eternal figure. She is the woman who loves the golden hair. The world of law and the world of legends are 2 distinct parts of the universe, and perhaps, after the woman who loves gold appears to the young man, then their story moves faster. In her ability to get the plot of life moving, the woman with the golden hair resembles the Hindu feminine, the Shakti. Shakti is instigating, upleaping, fiery, and outrageous. Shiva, on the other side, lies upon the ground and is by contrast receptive, cool, laid back, and deeply inside himself. Moving forward in the story, Saturn is the god of ashes, and he is lethargic, depressed, a cinder-biting god whom the young man worships when it is the right time in his life for ashes. Saturn is dense, condensed, heavy, and driven. He becomes discipline in lucky men, and a sour or bitter feeling in unlucky men. Saturn is the god of correct failure. Hermes is the god of the interior nervous system. His presence amounts to heavenly wit. When we are in the Hermes field, messages pass with fantastic speed between the brain and fingertips, between the heart and tear ducts, between the part of us that is suffering and the part of us that laughs. Hermes is Mercury, and we know that Mercury cannot be held in hand. It rolls everywhere, separates into tiny drops, joins again, falls on the floor, falls under the bale, and moves with amazing quickness. It is correctly called quicksilver. This mercurial energy is called, among other things, Odin in Northern Europe or Hermes in Greece. Sometimes when friends are talking in a closed room, the heat of the conversation begins to increase. Witty things are said, contributions flow from all sides, leaps of imagination appear. The genuinely spiritual follows an instant after the genuinely obscene. This is a sign that Hermes has arrived. At some beautiful moment in the conversation, a silence may fall that feels mysterious or mystical. Then everyone hesitates to break it. This was called Hermes' silence. The old traditions maintain that true learning does not take place unless Hermes is present. Hermes is a magical, detail-loving, obscene, dancing, goofy, and not on a career track. Hermes slips us true information in that split second between the moment your tongue starts a word and the moment it finishes. What people call a Freudian slip is really a Hermes precision. Hermes punctuates pomposity, piety, sureness, and self-satisfaction. Hermes is always active in the garden, by choosing the instant for the boy to take off his headcloth, by sending the ray up to the princess's room at the right second. He's in the choice of the wild flowers rather than tame flowers, and in giving away all the gold. Meet Hermes, ladies and gentlemen. Now you know. All this sun work is his. The planet Mercury is the nearest of all planets to the sun, and so he is the sun's closest relative. Alchemists knew that Mercury has the ability to liquefy gold and silver. We sense how stuck and stiff the masculine can become, and the feminine can become just as stuck. Mercury softens them in some way so that each can flow. In the presence of Hermes, a flow between masculine and feminine in our story has begun to happen. As a young man, as Iron John's student, I received multiple blessings that all started from a wound. One blessing came from Aphrodite, who is the woman who loves gold, and one from Hermes. Hermes and Aphrodite get along well together. Several surviving Greek sculptures show Aphrodite running her fingers through Hermes' hair. We know that not every god and goddess makes a good union, but Hermes and Aphrodite together are so good that they become the model for the hermaphrodite. It is a soul union of the Hermes in a man with the Aphrodite in a woman. When the woman who loves gold pulled off my red tarbouche, discovering what the king knew not, she gave me gold coins in return for the wild flowers, and each time the Hermes in us remarks,
"I'll give this gold to the gardener's children to play with."
That implies that whatever one receives in the garden is to be given away, and the head covering needs to remain on. A woman may be too eager for a young man to show his gold. In general, the public wants artists to show their gold immediately, but the Iron John story implies throughout that an artist should be cautious in showing off his or her paintings, poems, writing, or any creative work during the 20s or publishing too early. We have spoken of Hermes' part in hermetically sealing off a certain interior space, keeping out what needs to be kept out, and holding in what wants to be held in. Men who can prevent themselves from giving everything away to work and to the world find themselves able, at last, to enter the walled space, inside which certain magical events take place. Iron John wanted me to experience the garden. That's why he made me leave the sacred pond. And this may take years to develop, and once this has been experienced, then we could say that a young man has begun to honor his own soul. He has learned to become a lover, a poet, and he has learned to dance,
said the white buffalo.